Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 10th, 2020. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the opinion on Black Lives Matter and how drastically it has changed in just a short couple of days now. Taking a look at the overall national average, Black Lives Matter has been skyrocketing up in terms of approval from Americans. Before or prior to 2018, the overall feel for Black Lives Matter, whether it was after numerous police shootings or, treatment from the police in terms of different victims, especially in the African-American community. But, the Black Lives Matter movement has really centered itself around reformation of the police and the justice system and making it making themselves equal to everyone else in terms of the way that they're treated by police. And equality is just the center portion of this entire movement itself. The Black Lives Matter movement has recently come into light as a result of George Floyd and a number of other people, Breonna Taylor, just numerous people, even in the past, Tamir Rice. There are countless African-American citizens that were either, number one, gunned down by police with no weapon, or killed actually by the police in terms of the way what the final result was of their altercation with the police. And a lot of the times it wasn't at the result of the African-American citizen. A lot of the times this was because of mistreatment from the police. And whether or not America can agree on All Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter seems to be separating now. There was a big push for the All Lives Matter movement from the right in America just a short couple of years ago. We're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement versus Blue Lives Matter. And whether or not All Lives Matter really needs to come into the discussion for this, it really doesn't, because the main focus of this is now Americans are starting to, drastically shift their support. You can see the graph on your screen right now. Again, prior to 2018, most Americans did not support the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, it had an overall net negative. As things started to progress through 2018, 2019, as the names started adding up, people started to shift their public opinion. Sure, right as 2020 hit, the Black Lives Matter movement had an overall positive 10 in terms of how American voters view the organization itself, or more so the movement. But now, as a result of the protests and the riots and the things that are happening nationwide, you can see how it skyrockets up. Drastically increases in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what does this have to do with elections? Well, first things first, the Black Lives Matter movement is almost directly correlated with support for Democratic candidates. I know that the movement itself isn't necessarily tied to a political party. You can very well be a Republican and support Black Lives Matter. However, I will say the fact that there is an outraged, overall, just African-American base and other people of color, there is a very clear distinction in terms of this movement itself and other people of color, because again, a lot of the times we are seeing mistreatment of Black Americans, not so much Asian Americans, which I personally am, or, there is an issue in terms of minority treatment from police, but the main focus of this is pretty much the treatment of Black citizens in this country. Because a lot of the time, I'm not necessarily going to speak on this with full whatever, but I'm Asian American, I'm white passing 100%, so I could definitely see how being labeled as a person of color wouldn't necessarily apply to me, even though it does, and how it could necessarily it could misconstrue the entire point of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is pretty much centered around the mistreatment of Black Americans. While it does focus on police reform and equality nationwide, again, we're talking about an actual problem, which is the main issue with the All Lives Matter movement from the viewpoint of Americans. If you take a look at this, a lot of Americans do now support the Black Lives Matter movement, nearing 30% in terms of support for it in overall net. Right before this had happened, it was only a 10% net, which means that a lot of the, a lot of America did not necessarily support the Black Lives Matter movement. For whatever reason that might be, it could be from misinformation or, again, just their own personal beliefs. But as you can see, it has drastically increased. And I will say that this does have a very drastic shift on the electorate itself. Black Lives Matter is going to be a very important issue in the 2020 election, to say the least. I do think that this is going to be just as big as COVID-19. These protests are not dying down. Just because your social media feed is necessarily not showing as much of it, I promise you it is not dying down. I live close to DC. I can see things happening firsthand with my classmates and a number of other people that I see going to these protests. They are getting a lot more in terms of support, in terms of people going there, in terms of legislators coming to Congress and passing bills. Nancy Pelosi recently announced a bill. So a lot of these things, a lot of these protests are working nationwide. And I think America is starting to see that in the sense that they're starting to ask for change. A lot of the times, this Black Lives Matter movement didn't necessarily get the type of attention that it needed in the past in order to thrive that it's getting right now. Mainly because, number one, the American public didn't necessarily either approve of it at the time. Literally 4 years ago, it was in the negative. And if you take a look now, the reason why legislators are trying to push it is not because, to be very honest, it's not because they think that all of a sudden Black Lives Matter. Sure, some of them might, but the majority of them are listening to public opinion. And that may be unfortunate, but the results will be beneficial to America in a whole. If you take a look at this last minute, not necessarily last minute support, recent support jump, it's definitely going to overall force legislators nationwide, whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, to push for change, because you can't have 30% of the country 70% of the country asking for change. No, 80% of the country, asking for change, and you're not doing it. It's going to be very difficult for the entire, all of these incumbents to go back to their constituencies and say, I did absolutely nothing. In the height of this all, there was nothing that I personally could have done. I've seen a lot of people get angry at a lot of these congressional members taking a knee or having moments of silence because they have the power to change things. And I think that the American public really does want to see a lot of change in terms of this. If you take a look at registered voters, plus 28 versus 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago versus now, net support. So 28 overall gain, change equivalent to the previous 21 months. So a lot of these may not necessarily be the same time period. I think a better show of the overall support for this itself should be better reflected by something like this, because we do have a lot of issues nationwide that a lot of people may see a lot more support for. Gun control, number one, impeaching President Trump, talking about Russia, a border wall with Mexico, a number of things, but a lot of the time these things don't drastically change. No matter how many things you saw in 2010 when you saw the protests against Barack Obama, the Tea Party never really had a spike in terms of approval now, and also, again, there aren't necessarily any protests in terms of this. But I will say that if you take a look at all of these things that are happening, a lot of the time these certain issues, which are top issues, immigrant pathway to citizenship, legalization of cannabis, weed, border wall with Mexico, a lot of these things that are main election issues don't necessarily see too many drastic decreases or increases of support. Not even gun control. Right after the Parkland school shooting, there was a very small increase of support, around probably 8 to 11%, taking a look at the rest of this graph, and taking a look, maybe 8 to 12% nationwide. A 12% overall more people approve of gun control than disapprove of it. But as you can see, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, though it was increasing, it wasn't increasing by too drastic of a margin. And as you can see, it's pretty much skyrocketed. It's very similar to what we saw with impeachment support. However, when you take a look at the overall margins, this up to 28 was a lot better than a 4-point gain for gun control, regardless of the severity of the issue that had happened in the Parkland school shooting. The American people did not really shift that much, to be completely honest. This graph only looks a lot because they've narrowed down the overall y-axis itself. For the Black Lives Matter net support, it has drastically increased. And I think that this is going to impact a number of states. So this is where we tie it back into the 2020 election. On your screen right now, I've characterized all of the states with a population of 10% African-American citizens or more. When you take a look at the tilt states, the states that are, they actually look a little bit darker, but that's mainly because they are very light and you can pretty much see through the gray. But there's 143 electoral votes in which 1 in 10 citizens in that state are black. When you take a look at the rest of the country, again, a lot of these states are gray, so a lot of states may not have necessarily too large of an African-American population, which is exactly why a lot of the times a lot of politicians there pander towards whiter voters, or in states like California, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Hispanic voters. But we're talking about, Black Lives Matter, so I do think that it would be very reflective of the groups that are necessarily going to be personally outraged by the recent events in this country. While I do think that a lot of America, and as you can see, taking a look at this data, every single part of America, Democrat, Republican, Independent, a lot of them have all shifted in favor of supporting Black Lives Matter. While some areas, including the Republican Party, still may be in the net negative, pretty much everywhere else you can see an overall positive in terms of the approval. If you look in white voters, black voters, Hispanic or Latino voters, others, when you take a look at that, you can pretty much see how though the entire country is outraged, I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement will directly impact, well, it does directly impact the results of these things, will directly benefit the African American community if legislation is actually passed in Congress. Congress is notorious for putting everything on the table and just not voting on it, or Donald Trump could veto it. You never know. But Donald Trump has pretty much taken a firm opposition to this, which is exactly why, again, we're talking about the election. We're talking about how this ties into the 2020 electorate. And I will say that Donald Trump's opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement itself, or the protests that are happening, referring to, while he may be referring to those who take advantage of the situation, to referring to them as thugs and saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Again, America doesn't necessarily view those things beneficial. Again, whether or not you approve of President Trump, it doesn't matter. He is comparing stealing from a Target to the equivalent of doing something that could result in the death penalty. He is saying shoot people who loot stores. And I understand, what about small businesses? What about homes that were being robbed? First of all, when you take a look at the overall stats, number one, most of the areas that were being robbed were things like Target and, a Home Depot down the street, companies that can recover. Whether or not it's wrong is not up for me to decide. That's up for you. But again, most of the time, small businesses are not happening. Retweeting a 1991 video of a black man in LA saying, "What did you do to my business?" is not helping your cause, because that is, number one, outdated, and number two, does not have any direct impact of what's happening right now. I understand there may be some small businesses that are hurting from this, but as you can see, if you look around, a lot of the times these protests aren't violent. And a lot of the times, a lot of the violence that actually does happen, in the sense that it does result in violence, a lot of the times, believe it or not, is incited by the police. I'm not saying that's every situation, because it isn't, but I'm saying that does happen, and you can't necessarily deny that. And I think America is starting to see that, whether it's on social media, whether it's through the national news media. We are starting to see videos circulate, and to be completely honest, this will all benefit the Democratic Party. There is no way Donald Trump could spin this in favor of him outside of some predominantly white states. Because just because there is an increase in Republican registration in a small pocket in Minnesota does not mean that this is going to benefit Donald Trump. Just because there may be one small area compared to the rest of the country shifting leftwards, if you take a look at national polls, statewide polls, approval rating polls, take a look at all of the things that are happening nationwide, the left is going to benefit from this. And especially in these key states. I understand that a lot of these states are going to be pretty solid for Donald Trump. States such as Tennessee or Arkansas or Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama. But increased African-American turnout will, number one, increase their representation in Congress if they are able to elect candidates that have their own personal interest. And also, a lot of the times, though these are Republican representatives, a lot of the times they are going to have to listen to their constituents. And I do think that this is going to impact the 2020 election, because a lot of the times these Democratic ads are replaying Trump's words. They're just taking his tweets and saying them. They're showing them on a screen and having a voiceover, because they speak for themselves. I've reiterated this point for the past month now. Donald Trump is essentially solidifying his own re-election bid loss. And when he won in 2016, the final 2 weeks of the campaign, when Hillary Clinton was pretty much moving down underwater but was still holding level head, Donald Trump did not make any major claims. Nothing the mainstream media could take and say Donald Trump is saying crazy things, because a lot of the time he does tweet what's on its mind, and whether or not you personally agree with that, the mainstream media eats that up. But in the final 2 weeks of the campaign, he kept silent, and he was able to put on a very, very presidential feel, very similar to the aspect of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or pretty much any other presidential candidate. But when you take a look at that, that was one of the main reasons he won. He was able to dial it back and win back a lot of those Republican voters that were a little iffy. And then all of a sudden, James Comey reopened the email investigation, and a number of things had come out from Hillary Clinton's campaign, from WikiLeaks, and it was just a really bad and perfect storm for Donald Trump. And he was able to ride off of it and not say anything too insane, I guess, for the mainstream media, because a lot of the times they will take that, even if it's not even super crazy, they will use it, because the media loves taking tweets from any type of politician and putting it out there, because it's a very open platform. And a lot of the times you just type 240 characters and press send. And whether or not that's what you're actually thinking or what your campaign wants you to put out, they will eat it up. I guarantee it. But besides that, when we take a look at these states, if you're wondering what the rest of the characterizations are, if it's a light yellow state, that means it's 15% to 25% in terms of, actually, no, I think 15% to 15% to 30% in terms of African-American population, and then 30% plus are considered to be these solid states. So it is pretty surprising to see the South very solid for in terms of African American population. These states are very, very Republican states: Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia. Whether or not they may have some blips where they do end up electing a statewide Democrat for the case of Louisiana, or coming close in a Senate election, or even going to a Democrat for Mississippi and Alabama. I don't necessarily think they're going to be super competitive on the presidential level, but we could possibly see it narrow in the presidential map. I understand that these will probably be won by Donald Trump. Actually, without a doubt, they will be won by Donald Trump, except for the state of Georgia. But increased African American turnout can only hurt him in these states, because when you take a look at the national African American vote, it's 90-8. Meaning Hillary Clinton won around 90% of the black vote, and Donald Trump won 8%. So if you talk about an area that has a population of 30% of African American voters, and let's say only around 60% of the population votes in these states, it's going to be pretty hurtful for the GOP, considering that they're only winning around 1 in 10 voters at that on the nationwide map. So when you think about that and you take a look at the overall demographics, increased black turnout will pretty much always benefit the Democratic Party. I understand there may be some very, very, very small precincts or counties that may prove otherwise, but on the overall grand scheme of things, increased African American turnout elects candidates like Barack Obama. 65% and 66% are numbers that Joe Biden's campaign are going to try to replicate. In 2012, 66% of registered black voters came out to vote in 2012. In 2016, only 59% of them did. So when you combine that information, Hillary Clinton lost states by very narrow margins. In states that actually had, Michigan and Pennsylvania specifically, that had a population of 10% or higher with black voters and or just black citizens. But when you take a look at that, if you take a look at the overall the fact that Hillary Clinton had lost by less than 1%, and all of a sudden now there is going to be a very huge jump in terms of African-American voters, it is going to benefit Joe Biden, and he's going to try to replicate the same time he was on the ballot in 2012 and 2008 with 66% turnout, possibly 67, 68. The American public is angry. And if you take a look at these national numbers, it's not just black voters. It's every type of voter. Democratic voters, independent voters, Republican voters, every age group, every education level, every race, pretty much every single part of the demographic breakdown approves of the Black Lives Matter movement. And with that comes an increase of Democratic support. So while this may not necessarily, I honestly cannot see this entire movement blowing over like a number of other things have in the past in terms of the 2020 election. I think that this is going to be a number one issue for the 2020 election. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are going to have to talk about this a lot longer than just 1 week. They aren't just going to have to address what's happening in Minneapolis or what's happening in DC or what's happening in Los Angeles or address the NYPD specifically. I think that this is going to be a number one issue. Americans are flocking to support it, as you can see, very drastically. I mean, literally in just 1 month, as you can see, it even less than a month actually, it drastically jumps up in terms of support nationwide. And I think that's number one, going to benefit the Democratic Party, but number two is going to make this probably the second, if not most popular issue for the 2020 election. I think COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement will be the two most talked about issues, but as 2020 has shown us, a lot more things can be thrown our way later down. But right now, I would say those are the top two issues for the 2020 election. Forget the economy at this point. Yes, there is a discussion about whether or not the economy can come back. But if you take a look at the report that was sent out, I think recently, yesterday or today, it predicts that unemployment will remain at 10% through 2020. So that's also worse news for Donald Trump than what he thought. So again, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I know a little bit of my personal opinion did seep into it, but it also is necessary if we're talking about the impact it has on voters, because these numbers don't necessarily reflect anything that we've seen in the past, because as you can see, a lot of the time this actually recently has drawn drastic support. It's very, very important to note that, yes, some of my personal bias did come into this video, but it was necessary. I do think that it was important to note that a lot of the times, some people may necessarily be too educated on topics such as this, and I will take it upon myself to put out things like this. Again, I'm not going to take an official stance as to what this means necessarily in terms of my support or non-support for either candidate. Personal opinions are my own. I do have them, but I'm not necessarily too keen on sharing them with you guys yet. that will probably come on my second channel. I know some of you guys have recently talked about that in the comment section. I know this video, wow, this video is really long. I apologize for that too. I really tried to condense this one, but I know I did go off on a couple of tangents. And if you don't necessarily agree with my opinion, I understand that. I can respect at least 90% of opinions, at least. When I say that, I don't mean like, oh, if I'm talking about like alt-right, alt-left type opinions that I can't necessarily stand behind, in terms of like kill the top 1%, or, you know, other statements very similar to that. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and step back before I say something, because this is supposed to be an unbiased channel. But again, this is a human endeavor. We do need to allow some of our own personal beliefs to come out. And if you don't necessarily agree with that, sorry. But yeah, so thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please consider joining on the little join button right next to my subscribe tab. And yeah, so thank you all for watching this video again, and I will see you all tomorrow.